Hey guys, Bandit here. You know, we've been doing this for a while, talking about video game universes, lore, and cool what-if ideas that I like to call theories, regardless of if that's technically scientifically accurate. The thing is, posting these theories on YouTube is both a blessing and a curse. Sure, it has the potential to reach people, but once a video gets to be a couple years old, the almighty algorithm more or less forgets completely about it, and they just sit there alone in their little corner of the internet, all but forgotten. That being said, I thought it would be neat to bring back some of my older, favorite theories from the channel for your either first time viewing or reviewing, streamline them, and bundle them all into a first collection of sorts. And don't worry, I haven't included any that have been disproven since posting. Rest assured, the collections of theories in this video will all still be possibilities in the Zelda universe to this day, and I hope you find them as interesting as I did. Without further ado, please sit back and enjoy the Super Bandit Collection of Zelda Theories, Volume 1.
I feel like I need to give you a forewarning for this video, because what you're about to watch may sound like one of the craziest things to ever be suggested about The Legend of Zelda. Keep in mind while watching that this is in fact a theory, not explicitly proven in-game or being heralded as being proven, but rather is an interesting what-if kind of scenario that I believe has some pretty decent merit, which is exactly the kind of video that I love doing on the channel. I was also helped by some of my fantastic fellow theorists over in my Discord server, and will be crediting them each fully at the end of the video, so please be sure to stay tuned for that. Now, without further ado, let's delve into the final Masked Nintendo Bandit theory for 2020. We're all familiar with Ocarina of Time, right? No? Alright, let me refresh your memory real quick. Link, the hero of time, draws the Master Sword and travels into the future by 7 years, defeats Ganondorf with the help of the sages and Zelda, who seals the Demon King in the realm of the beyond, then sends Link back in time to the now child timeline to relive his child days. Those days continue into the events of Majora's Mask, and centuries later the events of Twilight Princess, etc, etc. But let me pause right there and rewind a bit, because I already passed what the focal point of this entire theory is about. You see, when Zelda plays the Ocarina of Time and sends Link back in time by 7 years, something strange happens. Link had previously been sort of fast-forwarding into the future by drawing the sword, and rewinding back into the past by placing it into its pedestal, as evidenced by his age. But now, when Zelda sent Link back in time for the final time using the Ocarina of Time, the hero of time was rewound into the past like before, but this time, since the sword was not involved in his time travel, he was also actually removed from the current adult timeline and placed instead in the child timeline, shattering the connection between the 2 points in time and instead creating 2 completely different timelines. This specific piece of lore isn't ever debated and is evidenced by the official timeline and beginning animation of the game Wind Waker when it details the legend of the hero of time, who simply appears out of nowhere and then disappears from their timeline after defeating Ganon, never to be seen again. And after the credits roll in Ocarina of Time, Link is shown to be kind of waking up in this new child timeline where Zelda sent him, with the Master Sword sitting quietly in front of him. This is what I wanted to talk about, the Master Sword. You see, I'd like to propose a question that has the potential to change the Legend of Zelda as we know it. And that question is this: what if the Master Sword was also removed along with Link from the adult timeline? Let's talk about why this is a possibility first, and then we'll talk about why it's a probability. Visually, we can see that Zelda uses the Ocarina and does in fact send Link back in time with the Master Sword still on his back. And when Link is shown next, he's glancing with surprise at his body, realizing he's a child again, something that hasn't surprised him since the very first time he drew the Master Sword, implying very strongly that this wasn't his doing. He didn't place the Master Sword back in the pedestal this time. It was most likely the work of Zelda and the Ocarina sending him there. But the evidence here is more than just visual. In Twilight Princess, which features this very same Master Sword as it takes place in the timeline shown here, the hero of Twilight draws the sword from the pedestal that's present in the ruins of the Temple of Time that now exists in the Sacred Grove. The Temple of Time later on in the game becomes a dungeon that Link must complete, and he enters it by traveling to the Temple of Time's past and placing the Master Sword in its pedestal, in the past. Do you see what I'm saying? Link has now traveled at this point to a point in time before he drew the sword from this pedestal, yet the sword is not present here in the past. It's also unlikely that the sword was just simply taken by someone in the past, as it is shown in many games to only accept the hero as its wielder, and the hero of Twilight is most likely the hero that appeared immediately following the hero of time, since he is visited by the hero of time, aka aka the hero's shade. I believe that what this means is that this Master Sword, being a relic created by the goddesses themselves, transcends time and can only be present in one time frame or timeline at a time. Otherwise, Link should have come across the duplicate Master Sword when he walked through a portal to the past. And yes, I know that there are several appearances of the Master Sword in the Fallen timeline, but that timeline isn't like the adult and child ones. The Fallen timeline is actually not a timeline split, but is rather an alternate reality that happens if Link is defeated, meaning it operates on a different set of rules and can indeed feature the same blade at the same time. Bringing it back though, if we apply this evidence and logic to the Master Sword that has seemingly followed Link back in time at the end of Ocarina of Time, we can fairly safely deduce that it was in fact removed from the adult timeline, which is crazy to think about because it forces us to ask this next question. If this is the case, then what sword does Link draw in the Wind Waker if the Master Sword is no longer present in the adult timeline? Well, naturally, he draws the Master Sword. Are you confused yet? Good, let's continue. What if this is a different, man-made Master Sword? We know that the people of Hyrule are no strangers to attempting to make other Master Swords, as is evidenced by the Royal Guard swords in Breath of the Wild, which are said to be attempted replicas of the legendary blade using Sheikah technology. So let's assume for a moment that they were successful, and this is in fact another Master Sword. There are several differences between this Blade of Evil's Bane and the previous Blade of Evil's Bane that I'd like to point out. The first and most prevalent being its drastically different appearance. Wind Waker was created with a completely different, more cartoony art style, which is one thing, but while the blade does bear some similarities, this Master Sword features a different coloration, a different hilt, a different handle, and a strange symbol at the top of its handle that isn't present anywhere on the original Master Sword. And by the way, Nintendo is more than capable of designing the blade to look roughly the same across different games as they've done with Skyward Sword, Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess, and Breath of the Wild, which have each also featured different art styles, albeit not quite as drastic as Wind Waker's. Secondly, the Master Sword from Wind Waker is in a completely different location than where it was previously, its previous location being the Temple of Time. In the Wind Waker, the sword is present in a new chamber located underneath Hyrule Castle that is surrounded by images of the sages from Ocarina of Time. A new chamber of the sages, if you will. The Master Sword has never been kept inside the castle before or since. This blade also requires the prayers of 2 new sages to empower it with the power to defeat evil, when previously it was none other than the goddess Hylia herself who blessed the blade with that very power. The sages were not a part of the process at all. And finally, there's also the fact that the blade serves to effectively lock the entirety of Hyrule in a time stasis, which once again is a unique trait never seen before or since. There is also some evidence we can gather from Ganondorf's knowledge of the blade. When Link first confronts the Dark Lord, he laughs at the young hero's attempt to slay him, but what Ganondorf says at this time is particularly interesting. He says that the blade is also a sort of key, a most wretched little key that has kept a seal on me and my magic intact. And then he goes on to say, what you hold is useless. Go back to the world below and tell that to the pathetic fools who made this blade. There are 2 very big lore bombs he just dropped. The first being that the blade has been responsible for sealing his power and his monsters away. This contrasts where and how he was previously sealed at the end of Ocarina of Time. At the end of that game, Zelda states in the original Japanese version that Ganondorf had been sealed by the sages into the world of darkness, meaning he was not sealed in any part inside the original Master Sword. And I'll come back to why later on in this video. Secondly, he states that Link should take the blade back down to the world below, meaning Hyrule, and tell the, quote, pathetic fools who made this blade that its power has vanished. This is actually huge, as it implies the blade's creators to be residents of Hyrule. I highly doubt he would be referring to the goddesses as being in the land below and also being, you know, pathetic fools. If anything, Ganondorf respects the goddesses and even prays to them at the end of the game, as all he wants is their Triforce, so that he can bring glory to the land of Gerudo. But you know who he would call pathetic? The sages who previously sealed him away. But that's besides the point. What we now have is a blade that looks differently, functions differently, and is located in a different place than the original Blade of Evil's Bane, which was most likely removed from this timeline. Finally, it's time to piece all of this together. Let's take a look at what I believe happened before the events of the Wind Waker that led to this duplicate blade being made. In the age following the Hero of Time and original Master Sword's disappearance, the mortals of Hyrule experienced a time of peace. The 7 sages, who were still around after Link's disappearance as evidenced in the Sword Chamber, remembered the final words of Ganondorf, which promised promised that he would return so long as he held the Triforce of Power. Since they knew he would eventually return and the Master Sword was no longer around, they created a new Master Sword that operated off of their Sage power for the next hero to wield against the Demon King. An age passed. The Sage's numbers, for whatever reason, dwindled down to 2. Eventually, Ganon did indeed break out of the Sage's seal and once again terrorized the people of Hyrule. The Hyruleans then prayed to the gods above for the return of the Hero of Time, but no hero appeared. Which, by the way, if you're interested, I have another video covering, which will be linked in the description below. It was at this time that I believe the king and the allies of the goddesses took matters into their own hands to save the land of Hyrule. As we see from the Wind Waker, the king was the individual who was behind the breaking of the Triforce of Wisdom in an attempt to hide it and the princess from Ganondorf, who wanted the completed Triforce. But even though the Triforce of Courage had also been shattered and scattered across the land, they knew this was all at most a simple hindrance to the Dark Lord, and they still needed a hero to arise in order to defeat Ganon once and for all. But still no hero appeared. With his back up against the wall and no one and nowhere to turn to, the king then made a plea to the gods above, who, as we know, decided to flood the land of Hyrule, but according to the king, gave the Hylians some time to prepare. I believe he and the sages then laid a trap for Ganondorf and his forces by allowing them to enter the castle, and then freezing them in time with the sage and possibly Sheikah-made Master Sword, taking some Hylians to the mountaintops, and then allowing the gods to flood the world below in hopes of sealing Ganondorf beneath the waves forever, in the beautiful, destroyed land of Hyrule. But of course, Ganon was not so easily defeated. He once again broke free of his seal and emerged atop the waves and established the Forsaken Fortress. Ganondorf, who now knew of a new blade existing under the waves, then killed the final remaining sages that were empowering the blade in the Earth and Wind temples, partially in an attempt to free his power from the world below, but also preventing the blade from being able to be used by any potential hero, and also explaining why he knew of its lack of power in the game. Ganondorf had been burned once before by allowing and underestimating a young boy to obtain the legendary blade. And though he was unsure of the existence of a current hero, he was not about to make that same mistake twice. Then, the events of the game transpire, and when Link, who had not only retrieved the Master Sword but also led 2 new sages to the temples in order to empower it once more, defeated Ganondorf with the blade at the end of the game, the sword seals Ganondorf by turning him to stone, something the blade accomplished by the power of the sages that has never been seen before or since. The king, racked with guilt from wishing for the demise of his beloved land of Hyrule, wished now for its final destruction, leading to the land, her king, the demon, and the blade sleeping forever at the bottom of the ocean. It's the ultimate story of mortals trying desperately to save themselves from their own demise. And it all started with the forging of a new Master Sword. But that is just our theory. What do you think? Is the Master Sword actually a different blade in the Wind Waker, or the same blade every time it shows up? Let me know in the comments below.
Hey everyone, Bandit here. You ever had a friend or even just acquaintance that for some reason you can't explain just kind of hates you? Well, our best boy Link has a real knack for attracting those kinds of people, let me tell you. From his most recent adventure, Breath of the Wild, which includes a flying, talking piece of KFC that hates his guts, all the way back to the legendary Ocarina of Time, which included a little guy that similarly hated Link's guts. Not sure what it is about Link that makes people react this way to him sometimes. Maybe it's the whole goody two-shoes thing he's got going on, or maybe it's those blue eyes. But either way, as annoying as these kinds of characters are, would it make it any better if you knew that they felt badly about it afterwards? Well, what if I told you that we can actually deduce that this is indeed the case for Mido, that kokery jerk from our childhoods? But for those who maybe haven't played the game before, let me recap real quick just who Mido is and what role he played in Ocarina. In the Kokery Forest, which is where the game starts and where our young hero Link grew up, all the way until the ripe age of 9 or 10 when he was tasked with saving the world, you know, normal childhood stuff. Anyway, Mido was a notable member of the Kokery, the boss of the Kokery, in fact, and he served as a literal physical roadblock with some epic sidestepping skills and forced Link to go and find the Kokery sword, I know, it's so tiny, and a Deku shield. After you fetch these 2 items, he will begrudgingly step aside and allow you to pass through and encounter the Deku tree. Obviously, Mido is a necessary piece of game design from Nintendo to force players to at least learn a couple things and get their first sword and shield before taking on their first
first dungeon, but as far as lore or even personal reasons go, he probably stopped Link from progressing because he's madly jealous of Link, since in his own words, he can't believe that the benevolent Deku Tree would ask to talk to Link personally and not Mido. And of course, there's also a girl involved, Saria, you know, the sage of the forest, who Mido clearly had feelings for, yet was never able to get Saria to notice him like she did Link. And there's also the fact that the Deku Tree dies after Link goes to see him. So yeah, I can understand why he'd be a bit salty. Of course, it still doesn't make it right. Anyway, that was Mido. Most Ocarina of Time players remember him as some jerk and move on. But later on in the game, after Link obtains all 3 spiritual stones as a kid and opens the door of time in the Temple of Time and claims the Master Sword for his own, and subsequently allows Ganondorf free access to the Triforce, as most know, Link is then able to travel into the future by 7 years and explore the shattered world of Hyrule as an adult. If you go back to the Kokiri Forest, which you do have to do in order to complete the Forest Temple, you'll notice that monsters abound where they previously did not. Talk to a Kokiri child in sight of Saria's house, and they'll tell you that Mido said that the great Deku Tree withered because a boy named Link did something wrong to it, and only Saria defended Link before she left to the Forest Temple. Talk to another Kokiri in Mido's house, and they'll tell you that the monsters are here because of the Deku Tree's death. Now, this is some pretty pertinent information because it's made clear to us that not only was the Deku Tree's death pinned on Link by Mido, but that also means that since monsters are now ruining the once peaceful Kokiri Forest, due to Mido spreading this misinformation about Link killing the Deku Tree, the Kokiri now associate Link with the appearance of the monsters and therefore now hate Link. All of them do, except for Saria, according to that Kokiri in Saria's house. Fast forward a bit and Link has to traverse the Lost Woods in order to find the Forest Temple, and blocking the right path once again is everyone's favorite fiery red-headed shorty, Mido. He doesn't recognize you as Link, even though he notices that you're wearing quote Kokirish clothing, and refuses once again to allow you passage. Until you play Saria's song, of course. He notes that Saria only ever taught that song to her close friends, and though he's confused as to who you are in light of this, he finally lets you pass so that you can go and meet Saria and complete the Forest Temple. After completing the temple, if you go back and talk to Mido, Link explains that Saria isn't coming back because she's now a sage, to which Mido responds by saying his last and most important lines in the entire game. Oh, I see. Saria won't ever come back. But I made a promise to Saria. If Link came back, I would be sure to tell him that Saria had been waiting for him, because Saria really liked... Hey, you, if you see him somewhere, please let him know. And also, I'm sorry for being mean to him. Tell him that too. And after this, you never speak to him again, though he is seen once more at the very end of the game. About halfway through the credits roll, the music and visuals change pretty drastically into a full-on outdoor dance party at Lon Lon Ranch involving pretty much everyone you meet in the entire game. And I do mean everyone. There's the Gerudo, the Zora, the dancing couple, even Big Goron and the Kokiri children. The dance party takes place after Link and Zelda defeat Ganondorf at the end of the adult timeline, as evidenced by Malon's age, since she's grown up by the time of this dance party. And it's assumed that everyone is so happy and dancing and having a good time because Zelda, after the ending fight, was able to retake her kingdom as its rightful ruler and explain to everyone the tale of Link, the hero who traveled through time to defeat the aforementioned Ganondorf, which is why the tale of the hero of time has become legend by the time the Wind Waker takes place. And since Ganondorf is no more, that means they can all go back to living their happy, normal lives after 7 long years of serving an evil king. It's a happy time, which is why there's something so off about one of the characters who appears here. See, the Kokiri are dancing and playing around and having a good time, but one of them is not. You don't see Mido with the other children. In fact, you don't see him at all until after the music dies down, and he's shown to be sitting away from everyone else, alone. Well, not alone, he's got the Zora King with him, but I'm sure the Zora King is just sitting out there because he can't very well do much else, now can he? And moving anywhere would probably take him about... The essence of the sages causes Mido to briefly look skyward, but then the camera zooms off and that's it for the scene and Mido. It always struck me as strangely important that Mido would be secluding himself from everyone else, looking sadly at the ground. Why would he be over here sulking it up when there's a party to be had involving everyone, including all his close friends in the Kokiri? Being sad because of losing Saria is one thing, but most of the people dancing around the fire have also lost a notable member of their people groups due to the calling of the sages. Yet there's still plenty of cause cause for celebration, i.e. the defeat of Ganondorf. I think Mido's sulking behavior here was meant to tell us a story about how he's responding to the news about Link saving the world. And let me explain that further by way of a question. What is the only difference between Mido and everyone else at the party? The difference is Mido was the only person in the entire world of Hyrule who didn't believe in Link. Not only that, he's the only person who actually tried to stop Link and put him down, being jealous of him the entire time. And we know that these kinds of self-aware, sorrowful emotions were somewhere inside him because of his words to adult Link, where he says that he's sorry for how he treated Link as a child. He said that to a complete stranger adult, meaning he's dealing with immense feelings of guilt. Now, I could end the episode right here and say that prideful kid gets sad out of guilt and that's the end of the story. And if you only looked at Ocarina of Time, that's really all you could get from this information. But there's one more mention of Mido later on in the Zelda series that got my theory senses tingling. See, if you fast forward all the way to the end of the Fallen timeline, which is the alternate adult timeline that takes place if Link is killed by Ganondorf instead of killing Ganondorf, enabling Ganondorf to take the Triforce for himself, you eventually come to the last game in the timeline, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. In the game, there are 7 notable towns, 8 if you include the ruins of Old Kasuto. Some of the towns are named after the sages from Ocarina of Time. The towns of Saria, Darunia, Ruto, Rauru, and Naburu. Now, in real life, of course, since Zelda 2 came out a good decade before Ocarina of Time, clearly the town names were the inspirations for the names of the sages as far as development is concerned. But in regards to in-universe lore, since Ocarina of Time takes place before Zelda 2, the towns were in turn actually named after the sages, which makes sense. Since the Hero of Time would have fallen in this timeline, according to the backstory of A Link to the Past, the sages and people of Hyrule were the ones who stepped up to seal Ganondorf within the Sacred Realm, no doubt exalting their statuses as heroes, which is definitely worth naming a town after. But there are a few town names I didn't mention. The final 3 are named Kasuto, Old Kasuto, and the harbor town of Mido. That's right, Mido has a town named after him in the Fallen timeline. Now, names in Zelda games are always extremely important. I mean, half of Zelda theories out there are based off of similar names. And for good reason. Kakariko is always called Kakariko, Beetle is always called Beetle, and Impa is always called Impa, right? The Zelda dev team have always used names to connect pieces of lore or locations over the meta-narrative that is the universe of Zelda. So that begs the question, if the towns of Zelda 2 are mostly named after the sages, who are the heroes of the people, what could Mido have possibly done to exalt his status in a similar manner? You could say it's because he was the leader of the Kokiri, but Saria is already a sage of the Kokiri, which pretty much overshadows anything Mido could have been by just being their boss. I think it's something different, so let's rewind once again to the party scene at the end of Ocarina of Time. Notice that the Kokiri are outside of the Kokiri forest, which is something that the Kokiri said earlier in the game would kill them if they left, according to the Deku Tree. Clearly though, they're not dead, so what does this actually mean? The Deku Tree wouldn't lie, right? In my opinion, since Link and the Kokiri Children of the Lost Woods were based on and heavily inspired by Peter Pan and the eternally childlike Lost Boys, which Miyamoto confirmed in an interview with the French magazine Game Cult, it probably means that leaving the Lost Woods would result in the Kokiri giving up their immortal forms as children and aging as a normal human being would. Of course, leaving Neverland leading to aging is debatable in Peter Pan lore, but the movie Hook, which featured an aged Peter Pan for the first time, played by the actor and Zelda fanatic Robin Williams, may he rest in peace, did come out in 1991, a full 7 years before Ocarina of Time, so the very famous movie could have inspired the idea. We do also have some slight in-universe evidence of this being true, though what I'm about to say could easily be an entire theory video on its own. But let's jump over to the child timeline, which takes place before Ganondorf is able to conquer Hyrule, but yet does not feature the Deku Tree, the Kokiri, or their evolved forms, the Koroks. Or does it? See, it's been a theory for a while now that the people of Ordon Village may actually be the Kokiri that turned mortal and aged a bit, due to several reasons, which I'll state briefly. One, they border the Faron Woods, which has the Forest Temple inside it, which is a, get this, giant hollowed out tree with a parasite living inside that you have to cleanse, with the Kokiri symbol literally all over the inside. Sound familiar? Add this to the fact that a blonde-haired Ordonian man is named Fado, and in the alternate adult timeline, there is a blonde-haired Kokiri named Fado. Could Twilight Princess's Fado and Ordonian villagers be the Kokiri who left the forest or protection of the Deku Deku Tree and therefore began to age as mortals? Like I said, it's a theory in and of itself, but for the purposes of this video, let's just assume for a moment that it is true. Now back to the theory. In the Downfall timeline, this party would not have taken place. Instead, people would learn that Ganondorf had killed Link, the hero, which is kind of a bummer. This means that it was up to the sages and the people of Hyrule to fight against Ganon's forces that would soon be pouring out of the Dark World. This event is called the Imprisoning War in Zelda lore, and it is the only thing that we know of that happens between Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past. And notably, the rest of the timeline following A Link to the Past features no Kokiri or Deku Tree. So something tells me that whatever Mido did to make a name for himself to the Hylians, who would have been the ones to name the towns of Zelda too, it would have had to happen after Ocarina of Time and before A Link to the Past in the Imprisoning War. So here's my speculation based on everything we've talked about. Could it be that Mido, the one who assumedly already knows how to use a sword and a shield, and who was jealous of Link being called upon to be a hero by the Deku Tree, heard about Link falling heroically in combat against Ganondorf, who was also responsible for killing the Deku Tree by the way, and due to his guilt and newfound sense of vengeance decided to leave the Kokiri Forest to join the fight against Ganon, potentially even taking the Kokiri with him? And what if this war lasted a while, like wars can? Years even, which would have been long enough for Mido and potentially the other Kokiri children to grow up. And what if this led to Mido becoming a war hero, the leader of the Kokiri army? It is an intense contrast to the kid bully that we grew up knowing, but given all the facts across the Zelda universe and the disappearance of the Kokiri following the events of Ocarina of Time, I think this is the best answer to why Mido would have his name exalted to the status of the sages. But of course, this is all just my theory. There are still things we don't know, such as who Kasuto is and why a town would be named after them in that case. And there is of course the possibility that the name Mido was just that, a name. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. What is it about cracking necks that's so, disturbing? Maybe it's because the neck is a pretty sensitive area for most people. Or maybe it's that sickly sound effect that comes with the cracking of, bones. Whatever. Or maybe I'm just oversensitive. Anyway, for as impactful of a moment as good old Mummy Ganondorf's neck crack was, newer fans of the series will be surprised to hear that he wasn't the first one to make a snap crackle pop with his head holder. Oh no. Let me take you back to a villain from what is undoubtedly one of the best games in a series of games where each one is arguably one of the best. Except for these guys. Twilight Princess introduced the world to the villainy of the villainous villain that goes by the name of Zant, like ant with a Z. At the end of the game, major spoiler alert by the way, even though the game came out over 10 years ago. At the end of the game, when Link and Zelda defeat Ganondorf quote unquote once and for all, Ganondorf calls once again upon the divine prank, the power of the Triforce of power that rests within him. He holds his hand in the air, awaiting the surge of renewed strength that will enable him to cheat his impending death as he experienced once before. But to his dismay, instead what he then sees is Zant, who died a little while ago. He just stares at him for a few seconds and then... And immediately Ganondorf's life escapes his body and he dies, standing straight up with the Master Sword stabbed through his bod. For as legendary of a scene as that was, it's also incredibly confusing. What did the Zant head thing mean? Why did he even show up here? What does he have to do with Ganondorf or the power of the Triforce? In the same kind of style as I've done with one of my previous videos explaining that haunting Lanayru cutscene, also from this game, I'm going to explain what you just saw. And because what I'm gonna say isn't confirmed to be canon, this is what we call a theory. A Zelda theory. Let's begin. Actually, real quick guys, before getting into the nitty-gritty of this theory, make sure you're not just at the mercy of the YouTube algorithm, but are subscribed to the channel with that bell icon so you never miss out on an upload here at MNB. And of course, after you're done watching, leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Anywhoosies, I'm going to begin by just straight up telling you what I think the whole scene represents. I think Ganondorf's Triforce hand shine is more like a request for power, and Zant's neck snap is the denial of said request. Now, in order to explain explain that hypothesis, first we're going to talk about the significance of this entire moment here with Zant's neck doing the crack thing and G-Man straight up getting deleted. I wanted to point out that this scene is so impactful because it's happened to Ganondorf before. You see, after the events of the child ending of Ocarina of Time, Ganondorf is tried for his crimes and straight up sentenced to death. Death by stabbing, that is, through the belly. Seem familiar? And that's not the only similarity. Not only was he stabbed in the exact same spot that Link stabs him in at the end of the game, but when he's dying, the Triforce emblem on his hand begins to glow with the power of the goddesses, saving him from his otherwise certain death. The inability for even the sages to explain why Ganondorf was one of the chosen to bear the power of the gods is referred to as the infamous divine prank, and ultimately took them so off guard and resulted in Ganondorf killing the Sage of Water. But let's rewind and break this scene down to better understand what happens with Zant at the end of the game. So first up, we have Ganondorf's death, or near death. He's mortally wounded, bleeding out, moments away from meeting his makers. At the last moment, his hand begins to glow. Was it glowing before, when he was chained up, or when he initially got stabbed? Nope, it was not. And once it does begin to glow, Ganondorf's strength not only returns, but multiplies in force. But what happened to make his Triforce, the divine prank, come to fruition? Why didn't it, I don't know, prevent him from getting stabbed in the first place? Well, simply put, I think this gives us some hint as to how exactly Ganondorf's piece of the Triforce works. Think of it as a switch that isn't turned on all the time, but rather a switch that Ganondorf has to call upon when needed and can access upon his intent or upon his request. Maybe he actually didn't activate this power prior to being stabbed because he didn't even know he could do this. At this point, almost kicking the bucket, his thoughts became something like, I want to live. And this request went through, and he was granted the power to not only dodge his own death, but also literally break the physical chains holding him back from defeating his shiny enemies. So, who approved this request exactly? Did the goddesses themselves see the Demon King dying and go, oh, wait a second, I want that guy to live? Have you seen this rehydrated fan art? I don't think so. I think the goddesses had nothing to do with it actually, and that since Ganondorf's power lies within himself at the moment, he approved his own request at the moment. Now, the very astute of you watching this and paying attention to every word that I'm saying already probably know where I'm going with this theory. But stay tuned, I'm about to start drawing connections. Right after G-Man deletes Water Guy, he gets catapulted into Twilight Place. Sometime between this event and the events surrounding the game's ending, G-Man meets with Zant-Man, who immediately reveres the floating Ganondorf head as a god. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Ganondorf saw potential for his master plan in Mr. Zant, which led him to make a mistake that would, unbeknownst to him, lead to his eventual actual death at the hands of a certain farmer boy. Ganondorf tells Zant that he will house his power in Zant, granting him the ability to do things like curse Midna into being an adorable flying imp, break the Mirror of Twilight, and pass in between the World of Light and the World of Twilight at will. Oh, and also survive being in the Light World when the Twilight normally cannot. Which, by the way, is a pretty good segue into a neat theory on Midna and the Triforce of Wisdom I did a while back. Link will be in the description below and on the top right if you want to check that out. Anyway, on Ganondorf's side of things, he gave Zant part of his power in order to have a powerful pawn capable of paving the way to his eventual retaking of Hyrule Castle. The same goal he had originally in Ocarina of Time. He didn't care about Zant necessarily, and never shows any sort of remorse over the little guy's death at the hands of a pretty ticked imp lady. But, okay, why am I going over all this? Well, now that these pieces have been set, let's look once more at the events of Ganondorf's death. In the climactic ending of this epic 4-part final battle, Link and Ganondorf literally spar against each other in a legendary one-on-one sword fight to the death, while Zelda watches from beyond the magically enhanced barriers. After ex-farmer guy finally knocks G-Man to the ground and stabs him through the gut with the Master Sword, the fight has officially ended. Ganondorf stands, vows this is not the end, then makes the same request for power he learned from long ago, at which point Zant randomly shows up, cracks his neck to the side, and Ganondorf's life fades away. When I first saw this scene, the only thing that made sense for Ganondorf dying here as opposed to earlier in the game was that it was the Master Sword that prevented Ganondorf's survival. But if the sword seals away evil, why would it prevent the flow of the power of the Triforce, regardless of the bearer? I mean, are we trying to say that the Master Sword is more powerful than the Triforce itself? No, I think the answer has to do with the fact that Ganondorf is not the only bearer of the Triforce of Power at this point in time. You heard me. Remember when Ganondorf gave part of his power to Zant? Consider this. What if Ganondorf no longer had enough power within himself to revive himself alone? I mean, he had expended quite a bit of power in encasing the castle in a magic barrier, possessing Zelda, transforming into Dark Beast Ganon, creating ghostly enemies, and even affecting the weather, and erecting more mini impenetrable barriers and so much more. It's entirely possible that he spent all of the power he had left housed within himself while fighting Link, and this time, when he requested more power, the request went to where the remainder of his power lied, in Zant. Zant has been dead this whole time, watching over his quote-unquote god as he witnessed the complete lack of concern over his own death, and his own people, and his god's defeat at the hands of some boy. I think it's safe to say that Zant's faith in this false god was not only tested but was lost entirely. And when this god that was supposed to be all-powerful and was supposed to give him eternal reign over the Twilight instead reached out to him to save his dying life, the pathetic request was denied. Hey guys, MNB here. I just wanted to stop by and let you know that the official Zelda timeline is impossible. No, I'm not another one of those crazy theorists that try to reshape what is known to be canon just to fit their own agendas. At least I don't think I am. But come on, any Zelda fan out there who takes more than 2 seconds to think about the nature of the timeline knows there's something a bit off, right? You know what I'm talking about. The timeline split. Sure, having a single timeline split between the past and the future is decently explainable and in fact done all the time in other movies and video games, but I'm specifically talking about the problem child. You know, the fallen timeline. What if I told you that all your timeline concerns and all of your timeline worries are all because of this weirdly explained yet clearly important timeline split? And what if I told you that you're not alone? Because the fallen timeline is impossible. Okay, now, before I explain what the heck I'm on about, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you can beat that weird YouTube algorithm and turn on those notifications so you never miss an upload. And give this video a like after you're done watching if you like it. Now, I believe I owe you an explanation. The first thing I have to get out of the way in order to make this theory work is explaining how and why the fallen timeline is actually factually impossible. Now, keep in mind, we're dealing with timelines and such, so buckle your seatbelt because things may sound a little confusing. The fallen timeline is different from the adult and child timeline splits because those two timelines happen factually, as per the canonical story of the game. And if you're a little fuzzy on the matter, let me refresh your memory. Link pulls the Master Sword as a child and gets put to sleep for 7 years, then awakens in that future as an adult to defeat Ganondorf, then gets sent back in time to before any of this happened to live out the years that he missed as a little kid. Now that's all fine and peachy, but the fallen timeline does not work the same way. It only takes place if Ganondorf defeats Link as an adult. You see, it works as long as you don't think too hard about it. If the hero falls or dies as an adult from Ganondorf's hour of power, bada bing bada boom, you got yourself the fallen timeline. But you can't use that as justification for an entire canonical timeline split, because then you'd have to bring up things like, what about all the possible timeline splits that could take place if those annoying Boko plants kill you over and over again when you're just trying to get a stupid Deku stick? I mean, I'm not saying they ever killed me, but anyway, you get what I'm saying, right? If every single possibility of Link's death was heralded as a new timeline completely, then there's an infinite amount of possibilities. And with infinite possibilities, what's canon no longer matters. It's like Rick and Morty. They can literally make whatever they want and it's all canon, since they have a multiverse that encompasses every possibility. But at the end of the day, because of this kind of infinite possibility, everything is canon kind of structure, does what's considered canon really even matter? Okay, a simpler way to look at the problem with the fallen timeline is like if this were in programming language. The fallen timeline would be what is referred to as an if statement, as in if Link lives or if Link dies, different end products will be created according to that statement. But the end products for these statements cannot both exist. You either take the right path or the left path, not both. Link cannot both live creating the adult and child timelines, but also die creating the fallen timeline, while still maintaining logical structure for what is considered to be canon. It's impossible. Okay, so hopefully we're still all on the same page, but I mean, if you need to, watch that section a couple times over until it clicks. But what I'm basically saying is the fallen timeline is impossible as we know it. But what kind of a theorist would I be if I didn't have a way to make all three timelines logically exist at the same time? And it works perfectly. Alright, for those of you with your seatbelt still on, now put on a helmet because we're gonna get even crazier. So, in order to make the fallen timeline work, we need to redefine its origin. And in order to define its origin, we need to define what needs to happen to the world to meet the requirements for the fallen timeline. So what are the requirements, I hear you asking? Well, the first requirement is Link having to somehow fail to stop Ganondorf's plans from happening. And the second requirement is that the Dark World has to be created. The way the Dark World was created was by Ganondorf's being sealed in the Sacred Realm along with the Triforce. Yeah, it's a whole... look up the beginning of A Link to the Past for an explanation on that one. Anyway, and Ganondorf basically using the power of the Triforce to turn the ex-Sacred Realm into the Dark World, which is a world parallel to the Realm of Light, which is also to say the normal world. Oh, and the third requirement is that it has to fit with the inevitable canon story of Ocarina of Time, of course. Now, what if I told you that all these requirements are all met in Link's natural timeline? The first thing people normally think about when you talk about Link's natural or original timeline in Ocarina of Time is the child timeline. I mean, that's where Zelda sends him back at the end of the game, but this is not the case. I'm gonna try to edit some visuals to help me explain this, but I'm not the greatest editor, so, you know, have mercy on me if it ends up looking terrible. Imagine this is Link's original timeline. Before Zelda, before the Ocarina, before the sword. Navi wakes him up here, he climbs out of his treehouse here, he gets engaged to Princess Ruto here, blah blah blah, and moves along this timeline until Zelda, the Ocarina, and the sword come into his possession. At which point he jumps to this point in the timeline, 7 years in the future. You with me so far? Good. Now, throughout Link's quest, there are certain times that arise when he has to jump back and forth in between timelines to solve quests, and sometimes even entire dungeons. And the thing is, even when you're playing as an adult, time is still passing in your original time frame, the one that you keep jumping back to. For instance, if you need to complete the Spirit Temple and you jump back in time to complete the Kid Link portion and get the Silver Gauntlets, then jump forward to complete the Adult Link remainder, if you go back in time again after that fact, the Silver Gauntlets will not return to the dungeon from out of your inventory. Meaning, even though you've gone back in time, you've still already beaten that portion of the dungeon as a kid. Time has passed in the past. Now here is when it gets super interesting. At the end of the adult portion of the game, Zelda sends Link back in time to regain his lost childhood, right? She sends him to before she ever left the castle courtyard, meaning she sent him back to before any of these events transpired, right around here. And if the adult timeline spawned off of the events at this point, and the child timeline spawned off of the events at this point, then what about the timeline that existed in between? Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the fallen timeline, or as I like to call it now, the abandoned timeline. It's the only time frame that canonically inevitably happens in the events of Ocarina of Time that also fits the other two requirements of the Sacred Realm with the Triforce inside being exposed to Ganondorf and Link not being around to stop him. This makes it possible for all three timelines to exist without any if statements or impossible stretches of logic. One thing we do need an explanation for would be, what if the Triforce splits when Ganondorf touches it? Won't it just go to Link and Zelda, preventing the creation of the Sacred Realm? How then would Ganondorf regain the pieces? Well, as for the Triforce of Wisdom resting in Zelda, I'm pretty sure Ganondorf has never had a real big problem finding her before, so that wouldn't be a problem for him. The Triforce of Courage would split, but would not find its way to Link because, well, he's gone from the timeline. And as we see in the Wind Waker, when the Triforce is split but an individual piece does not have a bearer, that piece will just split up into different shards to attempt to avoid being misused. So honestly, Ganondorf would just have to pick up the pieces and boom, he's got the full Triforce. Or maybe it just didn't split in the first place when they had him sealed inside. That's an easier explanation. But anyway, that is my theory on how to fix the fallen timeline and make it tangibly canon. It fits all the criteria to me. But what do you guys think? Is there something I missed along the way? Let me know in the comments below. The Legend of Zelda has had many heroes over the years, from the hero of the skies to the hero of winds to the hero of the wild. Each of these heroes is a boy named Link who has defied all odds and expectations and saved the world of the goddesses from the clutches of evil. But though each Link has their fair share of heroic deeds, one in particular stands out head and shoulders above the rest of them. And I mean that somewhat literally. This iconic hero among heroes is the one and only Hero of Time, from the games Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, oh yeah, and Twilight Princess. For those who have played the games, we know that the Hero of Time lived on after his adventures in Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, and the next time we see our beloved Ocarina player, he's dead. He's a ghost that can't move on into the next world and lingers on in our own world because he has unfinished business, which, according to his own words, is because he, quote, could not convey the lessons of that life to those who came after, end quote. By the end of Twilight Princess, he's eased his regrets and moved on. But here's where it gets interesting. If the Hero of Twilight is Time's descendant, that must have meant that the Hero of Time had children of his own blood in later years. If he wasn't able to teach his own children the lessons he needed to teach the Hero of Twilight, does that mean that he died unexpectedly? Does this mean that something killed him? Now I know what you're thinking. What if he died of natural causes? What in the world would have been able to kill the hero who defeated the Demon King Ganon as a 10-year-old boy in a 17-year-old's body? Good questions. Let's talk about them. First off, let's expound on what we know to be factual about the hero's shade so that we're all on the same page. As previously mentioned, according to the Hyrule Historia and in-game dialogue, the hero's shade is Link from Ocarina of Time. Another piece of evidence proving he's the ghost of the hero is that he also has a wolf form, just like the Hero of Twilight does, and his song selection for the Howling Stone segments are nearly all songs from Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask, both of which are adventures of the Hero of Time. Furthermore, we know that the shade is an ancestor to at least the Hero of Twilight because of the in-game piece of dialogue where he mentions the Hero of Twilight is carrying the hero's bloodline, and he's hellbound on teaching his secrets to the next generation, the Hero of Twilight. After he's done teaching the Hero of Twilight all of his super secret samurai sword skills, he states that he has at last eased his regrets before uttering his final farewell. But once we begin looking at the visual clues we can get from the shade's appearance, questions begin to start popping up. Most obviously, the hero shade is fully clad in armor. Now while this could be personal armor he had whipped up for himself later on in life, I tend to think that it's knightly armor. If you look closely at the more raggedy portions, you can see the armor included a layer of chainmail which has been either pierced or rotted away, and chainmail is not only a historical staple of knightly armor, but is worn by all the Hylian soldiers in Twilight Princess. The helmet is also rather showy, which was typical in historical times as a show of rank. For example, Roman centurions who outranked regular soldiers would wear these really floofy things on their heads as a sign of their rank and authority. You don't see any personal armor sets looking that showy throughout history, unless of course we're talking about Skyrim. His armor does have markings on it, but no matter how much I've tried, I can't link the designs to any people group across the Zelda franchise. If you think you know something about the markings on his armor, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Now let's look at the state of his overall, self. The fact that the body we can see fades in and out of visibility means he's some sort of specter or ghost, and not a Stalfos, which is a physical skeletal enemy, though yes, he does bear some visual similarities. His armor is old, cracked, and rotted, but more importantly, it's battle-hardened. We can see that one of his helmet's horns is cut off, not worn or rotted, but cleanly sliced off, indicating battle against sword users, or maybe a nasty beast with really sharp claws. Oh yeah, and he's also missing an eye. There doesn't appear to be a scar on his face surrounding his eye, meaning, and I apologize if this is a little gross, but this most likely means that his eye got damaged by something piercing it and then it had to be removed. Finally, we see that he doesn't exactly look like he's been buried. I mean, do you see what he's covered in? Leaves. Lots of leaves. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think leaves tend to sprout around and grow when they're 6 feet under. No, this guy is dead and isn't buried. And it's from this that I deduce he died out in the field, fully clad, in battle, and his body was most likely never found. This would explain why he's a regretful ghost now. He was taken from this world before he wanted to be. He didn't get to say goodbye to his children or his wife. Sounds like a classic vengeful ghost story to me. So now that we're all on the same page with what must have happened to the hero of time, it's time for the big question. Who or what did this to the hero? We have a few clues. 1. He was killed in an area that would probably support lush greenery as we see vines growing on his armor. 2. The killing blow was most likely delivered to his abdomen, as that's the only part of his armor that appears to be completely destroyed, and would therefore mean he was most likely dealt a killing blow that would look something like, well... which means his attacker was most likely a blade-wielding foe. This is all complete speculation, of course, but here are 2 of my guesses. 1. He may have been in the Lost Woods when a Stalfos got the better of him. Maybe multiple Stalfos. Maybe they outnumbered him, and after all those years of the hero being triumphant over the skeletal enemies, they finally overpowered him, and he paid the price with his life. Another really interesting idea is that his old foe, Dark Link himself, caught back up with him, but this time Dark Link was victorious. It's important to note that we don't see Dark Link die in the Water Temple after we battle him. He just kind of fades away the same as he had been doing throughout their whole battle anyway. We do see references to Dark Link in Twilight Princess. So if the entity was still alive between the events of Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, I think it's probable that Link crossed paths with his old foe again. What if Link met with him in the Lost Woods, where he's from, to finish what was started long ago and truly defeat the darkness within himself? Only this time, without the Master Sword, he met his ultimate demise. You gotta admit, it's incredibly poetic, but also just a theory. A Zelda theory. I have no idea where I got that from.
Hey guys, it's me, Real Bandit. Stay tuned till after the video for not a sponsored segment, but a message from me to you. For as beautiful of a game as Twilight Princess was, and yes, that's a hill I'm 100% willing to die on, it was lacking some pretty obvious Zelda-isms. For instance, in Ocarina of Time, we were introduced to the legendary Great Deku Tree, who's supposed to be one of Hyrule's watchful protector spirits. The tree even makes a reappearance in The Wind Waker, as do its fellow Kokiri children, reincarnated as the airborne Koroks. But in Twilight Princess, both the Great Deku Tree itself and the Kokiri/Koroks are nowhere to be found. Then there's the mysterious disappearance of the Gerudo tribe, who were a pretty darn big deal in Ocarina of Time. There's even the entire Gerudo Desert area in Twilight Princess, implying pretty heavily that they were here at one point in time, so what gives? Are there any explanations for these missing pieces of the land of Hyrule? Well, friend, let me tell ya, the Zelda universe is a mysterious one, alright, filled with many questions and unfortunately not quite as many answers. But in the midst of all the mystery and apparent loose ends, there is lore. Bounteous lore. Enough lore to enable us to speculate and theorize about what happened in between the Zelda games that could explain the differences between their respective lands of Hyrule. And if you're interested in the lore behind why the Gerudo aren't in Twilight Princess, check out my theory on it, link in the description below. But that's not what we're going to focus on in this video. Instead, we're going to talk about that first bit I mentioned, the disappearance of the Great Deku Tree and all its inhabitants. But let's start with what we know. Link starts off in the game as a humble villager from the village of Ordon. He lives in a treehouse that's located right outside a dense forest, almost exactly like the Link from Ocarina of Time actually, except for one very telling detail. The inhabitants of this village aren't Kokiri children, they're grown-ups. Well, most of them anyway. But the one thing that's always bugged me when I played the game for the first time was the appearance of these Ordonians. This might sound like a huge nitpick, but hear me out. Have you ever noticed their ears? Specifically how round they are? Listen, any Zelda fan worth their salt knows that Hylians have pointed ears. This is something that's been true since the beginning, and most notably since the jump to 3D. In Ocarina of Time, the only people who didn't have pointed ears were the Gerudo. The women in Gerudo Valley and even King Ganondorf himself all sport nice, normal-looking rounded ears, while everyone else in the game has pointed ones. Listen, I know you may be rolling your eyes right now, but trust me, it's a big deal. I even made a video about Ganondorf's ears. I'm pointing all this out, no pun intended, because according to the aforementioned games and even some lore we can read in Masterworks Creating a Champion, ear shape is indicative of the Hylian race, meaning quite literally that in Twilight Princess, Link is Hylian, but the Ordonians specifically are not. Now, of course, the people of Ordon aren't the only characters in the game with not pointy ears, but that doesn't really matter for this theory. The only fact I want to drive home here is that Ordonians are not Hylians. They're another race entirely. So this begs the question, what are they? Well, I'll just go ahead and spoil the ending of the theory by saying I'm gonna try to prove to you that they are, in fact, the Kokiri from Ocarina of Time. So let me explain. Rewind back to the events of Ocarina of Time. At the end of the game, the new Deku Tree is sprouting and growing, and Link has defeated Ganondorf and sealed him away, and all is well and good. But that was the adult timeline, which leads directly into the events of the Wind Waker, and specifically into the new Great Deku Tree and the evolutionary Koroks. When Link is sent back in time, though, at the end of the game, the child timeline is created, and in that timeline, the Great Deku Tree dies and no sprout is formed. See, in the adult timeline, Link ages forward by 7 years and then returns to the Lost Woods in order to break the curse on the Forest Temple. Only by doing this is the Deku Tree sprout able to, sprout. This is according to the little guy's own words and is evidenced by the fact that the sprout didn't sprout for 7 long years until Link defeated the Forest Temple. But 7 years ago, Link never did this, meaning the new Deku Tree never came into existence. This explains per lore the absence of a Great Deku Tree in Twilight Princess. But what does this mean for the Kokiri of Ocarina of Time? According to the Kokiri themselves, the Great Deku Tree taught them that if any of them were to ever leave the woods, they would die. This, however, is a lie. Well, kind of. See, at the end of the game, there are clearly several, if not all, of the Kokiri children outside of the woods. They're shown to be partaking in the wild party being thrown in the wake of Ganondorf's demise. This takes place in the corral of Lon Lon Ranch, pretty darn far away from the Kokiri forest, so clearly when the Kokiri leave the woods, in the words of Satan, ye shall not surely die. But does this mean that the Deku Tree was lying to them? I mean, what was the point? Just to spread some fear-mongering amongst the little forest children? This is purely theoretical, but I personally believe that what the Deku Tree meant by this is that if the Kokiri were to ever leave the Kokiri forest, no, they won't drop dead, but they will be leaving the protection and influence of the Deku Tree, seeing as he is the protector of the forest, meaning that what he meant by if you leave the forest is really if you leave me. See, the reason why I quoted from the Bible a few moments ago was because I feel like something similar is happening here. As I'm sure some of you know, in the early chapters of the book of Genesis, the story goes that the immortal Adam and Eve partook of a forbidden fruit which God told them they'd die if they ever ate. However, after they ate it, they didn't die. Rather, they turned mortal. Death was added to their life, if you will. I can't help but feel that this is what the Deku Tree meant by saying the Kokiri would die if they left him when clearly they don't. Perhaps what he meant is that if they left his protection, death would be added to their life. They would become mortal. And in the child timeline events following Ocarina of Time, the Great Deku Tree is dead and gone, meaning his protection is dead and gone. And the Kokiri themselves would therefore quote-unquote die and become mortal and be devoid of a guardian spirit. Now let's return to Twilight Princess. In this game, the only thing we have connecting the Kokiri to the world directly would be their blatantly obvious symbol present in the Forest Temple. I mean, it is obviously the Kokiri symbol and it's all over the place, which implies that the entire temple itself was built and once inhabited by the Kokiri. And you know what the temple actually is? A giant hollowed out tree. Now, let me think, when have we ever seen a giant tree associated with the Kokiri before? Oh yeah, that's right. In Wind Waker, in Ocarina of Time, and recently Breath of the Wild, where the Kokiri/Koroks are associated with the Great Deku Tree. And it just so happens that in this timeline, the Great Deku Tree is dead, hollowed out. Remember what happens in Ocarina of Time when the Deku Tree dies? Monsters begin to invade the forest. So what if the Kokiri were forced to move further into the woods to escape the growing number of monsters? What if they took shelter within the husk of their dead protector, the Deku Tree, and transformed the inside of the tree into what we now recognize as the Forest Temple in Twilight Princess? But as we can see, once the corruption of the Twilight started to invade Hyrule prior to the events of Twilight Princess, the Forest Temple itself started to become a dangerous place, and was subsequently abandoned by the Kokiri, who then moved once again to establish a new village, the village of Ordon, where they lived on until the events of Twilight Princess. And if the Kokiri really are the Ordonians, this explains why there are Kokiri symbols in the Forest Temple and why the villagers of Ordon, who are not Hylians, live right outside Faron Woods, which, get this, was called the Kokiri Forest in Ocarina of Time according to the encyclopedia. And why one of the Ordonian people is literally named Fado, or Fado, however you say that, which is notably the same name as a famous Kokiri scary individual who has popped up multiple times in the series. Now, there's a lot of proof in favor of this theory, but there are a couple counterpoints which I'll discuss briefly. The first being that the Forest Temple in Twilight Princess doesn't look much like the Deku Tree from Ocarina of Time, and its location doesn't exactly match up. I see your point, and I raise you a neither does Death Mountain, or Lake Hylia, or Gerudo Desert, or Zora's Domain, or Hyrule Castle. Listen, I personally don't put too much stock into trying to figure out why the layout or appearance of the land of Hyrule seems to change so much from game to game, especially when you've got Twilight Princess taking place apparently only like 100 to 200 years after Ocarina of Time, according to Aonuma himself. And I'm not a geologist, but I'm pretty sure that doesn't give that much time for natural changes to landscape, especially not changes of this scale. There's just no way, besides extremely large leaps of speculation, to explain why Zora's Domain is now located to the far north of Hyrule Castle, or why the Temple of Time is now located within a forest, or why the Gerudo Desert is now on the other side of Lake Hylia when before it was neighboring it and connected by a river. It's just as important as figuring something out is to admit when you can't figure something out. I mean, after all, we're just supposed to accept that this volcano is the same as this volcano, and that this lake is the same as this lake. So I personally don't mind believing that this large tree in Faron Wood / Kokiri Forest surrounded by Kokiri symbolism is now this large tree in Faron Wood / Kokiri Forest surrounded by Kokiri symbolism. Especially when it would answer pretty much everything regarding the mysterious disappearances of the forest dwellers. The second counterpoint is that the Kokiri evolved into the monkeys present around the Forest Temple and not the Ordonians themselves. Now clearly I agree that the Kokiri evolved, since that's the one thing they're shown to always do in other games. But I think their evolution was into regular mortal people, complete with regular mortal rounded ears. I won't deny though that it's possible that the Kokiri did evolve into the monkeys. I mean, hell, maybe even Mido evolved into Ook the baboon. But I just find it hard to believe that they'd evolve into a form that can't speak, as that's never been the case in any of the other games that they're present in. I also feel that the Kokiri's special forms are given to them by way of the power of the Deku Tree, and that without the Deku Tree, they'd turn into a regular non-magical form, which would in this case be the non-magical ordinary Ordonian humans. Although this could also be said about turning into ordinary non-magical monkeys. That much I can't refute fully, so I'll admit it is possible that they evolved into the monkeys. But this is all just my theory. What do you guys think? Did the Kokiri evolve into the Ordonians of Twilight Princess? Did they turn into the monkeys? Or are they all actually dead and gone and this is just a random forest and that is just a random tree? And that's just a random symbol? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider leaving a like if you enjoyed the theory or at least my efforts into it, and subscribe if you haven't already for many more super cool lore videos to come. Hey guys, it's me again, you know, Real Bandit. I just wanted to pop in real quick and talk about something rather tragic that happened to me recently. I was hacked. Personally. As in my personal Facebook account was hacked into and insta-banned, because that's how Meta customer service works. They claim that it's so bad because of COVID era, but apparently it's always been terrible, so I don't really know. Just pro tip, make sure you don't have anything on your social media networks that isn't backed up somewhere safe that you have access to, or else, you never know, you might get insta-banned and then immediately lose access to all sorts of stuff. I personally lost pictures and videos of when my parents were back together, of some of my grandparents that have moved on, of my own graduation, my little brother's graduation, the list goes on. But I'm bringing it up here not just to warn you guys about the dangers of keeping things online without backing them up, but also because my YouTuber Instagram account, you know, my Instagram account under Bandit Games was attached to my personal Facebook account. And it got deleted too. So I'm essentially just trying to pop up here and inform those of you who were following me, or if you'd like to follow me for all the fun, stupid stuff that I post there, that I have a new Instagram that's now under the name Jordan Herndon 96, which is just my real name. But don't worry, I have it under a much more safe Gmail account this time. I made a post about it actually a few days ago here on the channel, and a lot of people thought that the post itself was suspicious, which is just so ironic and funny the more that you think about it. But good on you people for being cautious, and I'm looking at you, Kinroar and my online ID. I assure you, it is I, the real bandit. Unless I'm a robot under the skin. I probably sounded off because I was, I don't know, frustrated, flustered, feeling hopeless. If you've ever had something stolen from you that is priceless, you probably understand the feeling. Anyway, that's the end of my ramble, but here's the recap for you. Number 1, follow me on Instagram at Jordan Herndon 96, and number 2, don't upload anything
anything on the internet that's important to you without backing it up first. That's all. This is Bandit, hoping forward to blah. This is Bandit, looking forward to seeing you next time, and signing out. Peace!